Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The Harry Potter universe is renowned not only for its heroic deeds, but also for its memorable villains, foremost among them Lord Voldemort, one of the most iconic antagonists in literary history. Yet even the most dangerous villains make mistakes, sometimes fatal, sometimes absurdly foolish. Today we'll revisit the strangest, most illogical, and contradictory decisions ever made by the villains of the wizarding world. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Voldemort, obsessed with theatrics. Lord Voldemort was the embodiment of fear and magical power. Yet when it came to Harry Potter, he often turned into a ham actor from a school play. Instead of killing the chosen one outright, he orchestrated elaborate performances. In Goblet of Fire, after regaining his physical form, Voldemort could have killed Harry with a flick of his wand, but chose to engage in a ritual duel. In Order of the Phoenix, he wasted precious time on speeches and threats, while Harry was weak and vulnerable. And in Deathly Hallows, he could have stormed Hogwarts and killed Harry before all the horcruxes were destroyed. But no, again he chose pomp and delay. Result, his obsession with showmanship cost him his life. Number 2. Lucius Malfoy, giving Ginny the diary. Lucius Malfoy is cunning, calculating, and extremely cautious. But in Chamber of Secrets, he made a move completely out of character. He handed Tom Riddle's magical diary to a 12-year-old girl. Of course, he had his motives: discredit Arthur Weasley and reopen the Chamber of Secrets. But handing a powerful artifact linked to the Dark Lord's soul to a child, that's insanity. Even if he didn't know it was a horcrux, it was still dangerously irresponsible. Result, a reckless act that nearly caused a catastrophe. Number 3. Quirrell, trying to kill Harry during the match. Professor Quirrell seemed like a timid, harmless teacher, but behind him lurked Voldemort himself. So it's baffling that he tried to kill Harry during a Quidditch match. Instead of eliminating the boy in private, he made a public attempt in front of hundreds of spectators by jinxing his broomstick. It not only failed, but nearly exposed him. A complete sabotage of his own cover. Result, a foolish improvisation that nearly blew his disguise. Number 4. Peter Pettigrew, hiding with the Weasleys. Peter Pettigrew was a coward, but not a fool. He faked his own death, framed Sirius Black, and vanished into hiding as a rat. Brilliant plan, except for one fatal flaw: he chose the Weasley family as his sanctuary. Arthur Weasley worked at the Ministry, his kids went to Hogwarts, and they were close to Harry. It was a ticking time bomb. Peter placed himself right back in the epicenter of everything he was trying to escape. And he was eventually found out. Result, cowardice overshadowed self-preservation. Number 5. Dolores Umbridge, firing Trelawney. Umbridge is one of the most hated characters, somehow even more than Voldemort. She wasn't just cruel, she was smart and manipulative. But in her obsession with control over Hogwarts, she made a stupid move. She tried to fire Trelawney. This led to open conflict with Dumbledore and alienated the teaching staff. And what did she gain? Nothing. Trelawney stayed, and Umbridge became even more isolated and despised. Result, a political blunder that sparked rebellion. Number 6. Gilderoy Lockhart, confessing to Harry and Ron. Lockhart isn't a typical villain, he's more of a comic antagonist. But in Chamber of Secrets, his mask slipped. Upon realizing that Harry and Ron had uncovered his lies, he told them everything. He could have denied it, run, or tried to mislead them. Instead, he openly confessed to his crimes. Worse, he tried to erase their memories unsuccessfully. In doing so, he completely exposed himself. Result, arrogance ruined the conman. Number 7. Bellatrix Lestrange, her relationship with Voldemort. Bellatrix was a mad fanatic, wholly devoted to Voldemort, but her relationship with the Dark Lord raises 1,000 questions. In The Cursed Child, we learn she had a daughter, Delphi, with him. It's hard to imagine a fanatical blood purist entering a relationship with a half-blood. She was also married, and such a liaison clashed with her image as the perfect soldier of darkness. Result, a contradiction between fanaticism and personal desire. Number 8, Draco Malfoy, hesitating on the astronomy tower. Draco Malfoy was given a mission meant for monsters. Kill Albus Dumbledore, earn Voldemort's trust, save his family from disgrace. But when the moment came, on the astronomy tower, wand trembling in hand, Draco froze. Dumbledore was disarmed, weak, alone. There was no duel, no fight, just a boy standing in front of a dying man, too scared to pull the trigger. "Draco," Dumbledore said softly, "you are not a killer." And that was the truth. Malfoy wanted to be feared, but he couldn't be ruthless. He stalled, he cried, he lowered his wand. Every second he hesitated, he gave the castle more time to wake up. Snape arrived. The unbreakable vow was fulfilled. But Draco's hesitation rewrote the scene. It was no longer a murder. It became a mercy killing by someone else. Voldemort had sent a message, complete the task or die trying. But Draco did neither. He walked away with bloodless hands and a shattered soul. From a villain's point of view, Draco failed. He had the perfect opportunity to rise, to prove himself. And yet, all he proved was his own fear. "I have to do this," he told Dumbledore, but even he didn't believe it. In trying to turn Draco into a weapon, Voldemort created a ghost, a boy haunted not by what he did, but by what he couldn't do, and that failure cost the Dark Lord more than he knew. Number 9, Barty Crouch Jr., overexposing himself while disguised. For a year, Barty Crouch Jr. walked the halls of Hogwarts in Alastair Moody's skin. He drank Polyjuice Potion, he mimicked the limp, he barked out orders like the grizzled Auror would, and it worked almost too well, but then he pushed it. He stood before a classroom of 4th years and cast Crucio on a spider, then Imperio, then Avada Kedavra, the unforgivable curses, all in one lesson. The room went silent. Neville Longbottom trembled. Hermione gasped. "The dark arts," he growled, "are many, varied, ever-changing." But it wasn't Moody speaking. It was a fanatic showing off. Crouch Jr. wanted to teach the students something real. That was his excuse. But underneath, he wanted to feel the power again. He enjoyed the fear. He reveled in control, and that was his mistake. Real Moody would have been cautious, paranoid, secretive, but this imposter kept handing out strange advice. He gave Harry tips. He showed him how to fight. He kept helping him survive. McGonagall noticed. Dumbledore watched. Snape began to suspect. By the third task, too many eyes were watching Mad Eye. When the truth unraveled, it came fast. Dumbledore stunned him. The Polyjuice wore off. And beneath the scars was a Death Eater who could have played the long game, but chose theatrics. In Goblet of Fire, Dumbledore says it simply, he seemed a little too keen to help. That eagerness, that thirst to be remembered, became the crack in a perfect disguise. Crouch Jr. didn't just fool everyone. He fooled himself. He thought he was untouchable. He thought power was a show, but in the end, it was his performance that gave him away. Number 10. Gellert Grindelwald, trusting Credence. Gellert Grindelwald built his empire on secrets. Every word he spoke had purpose. Every ally he chose was a pawn on a larger board. But when he met Credence Barebone, something cracked. He looked at a broken boy with a storm inside him and saw a weapon. Grindelwald whispered promises, fed him half-truths and gave him a name, Aurelius Dumbledore. That moment rewrote everything, but it also sealed his biggest mistake. Credence was unstable. He wasn't raised with magic. He had no control. His obscurial powers erupted in chaos, destroying cities and killing without thought. Grindelwald knew this, yet he placed his entire plot on the boy's shoulders. In The Crimes of Grindelwald, he brings Credence into the fold, says, "You are the key." He gives him a wand. He tells him to kill Albus, but Credence isn't ready. He doesn't trust himself, and worse, he doesn't fully trust Grindelwald. The plan crumbles. Credence wavers. At the fortress in Nurmengard, As Grindelwald stirs war and followers chant his name, the boy looks lost. In Secrets of Dumbledore, he begins to doubt. His power falters. The truth starts to surface. He's not a Dumbledore. He's a manipulated orphan, used by a man who saw only his rage. And when Credence switches sides, it's not with fire or drama. It's quiet, icy. A boy who finally understands he was nothing more than a tool. Grindelwald gambled everything on a lie. Not just the lie he told Credence, but the lie he told himself. That he could control chaos, that he could mold grief into loyalty. But Credence wasn't a soldier, he was a fracture, and when that fracture broke, so did Grindelwald's war, a master of manipulation brought down by a boy who just wanted to know who he was. Number 11, Voldemort, ignoring the power of House Elves. Voldemort never looked down. He saw power in bloodlines, curses, ancient names. But he never looked at those who served, who cooked, who listened from the shadows. House elves were nothing to him. Creatures of obedience, tools. But that blind arrogance became his weakness, because the elf he ignored, Dobby, was the one who ripped a hole in his prison. In Deathly Hallows, Harry and his friends are trapped in the cellar of Malfoy Manor. Bellatrix is upstairs torturing Hermione. Wormtail is pacing the halls. Escape seems impossible, but then Harry whispers one desperate plea, "Help us, Dobby." And the elf answers, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with magic Voldemort never understood. He apparates in and out of a mansion filled with Death Eaters. He snaps wands, grabs prisoners, and brings them to freedom. Dobby's final act wasn't a trick or a spell, it was loyalty. He dies with Harry's name on his lips, a free elf, a hero, and Voldemort never saw him coming because Voldemort believed real power wore robes, spoke Parseltongue, and carried a wand. He never imagined that a creature he called filth could slip through his defenses, destroy his plan, and save the Chosen One. If Voldemort had understood the elves, he would have sealed the manor. He would have guarded against their kind, but he didn't. He saw them as insects, and in doing so he gave Harry a weapon he couldn't block, someone who would act not out of fear, but out of love. It wasn't a prophecy or a duel that beat the Dark Lord that night. It was a knife thrown by a house elf. Number 12, Death Eaters, underestimating the Order of the Phoenix. The Death Eaters walked into the Department of Mysteries with wands drawn and heads high. They expected children. They found resistance. Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, and several others had one job: retrieve the prophecy. But their overconfidence cost them. They toyed with their prey. They mocked Harry, Neville, and Luna instead of finishing them. And when the Order of the Phoenix arrived, the tide turned. Sirius Black burst into the Hall of Prophecies like a storm. "Get away from my godson," he shouted, wand blazing. The ambush failed. They had the numbers. They lost control. Lucius tried to reason. Bellatrix screamed spells without aim. They had underestimated the one thing Voldemort always feared: loyalty. These weren't just fighters, they were family. Remus Lupin fought like a wolf. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood his ground like a statue, and Sirius died laughing, killed by his own cousin, yes, but only because the Death Eaters couldn't contain their arrogance. Bellatrix didn't win that night. She broke something inside Harry, and Voldemort paid the price for it. The prophecy shattered. The weapon they came for was gone. They left the Ministry wounded and exposed. Dumbledore arrived like thunder, dueling Voldemort himself. That moment was supposed to be a secret strike. Instead, it became a declaration of war. The world saw the Dark Lord. The Ministry could no longer deny, all because the Death Eaters believed they were invincible. They weren't. Had they acted with precision, the Order would have been crushed. But the Death Eaters never understood the strength of those who fight not for power, but for people. They saw the Order as weak, a handful of has-beens and rebels. But Alastor Moody, Nymphadora Tonks, and Molly Weasley weren't weak. They were prepared to die. The Death Eaters weren't, and that made all the difference. Number 13, Voldemort, distrusting Snape. Voldemort feared only one thing more than death: betrayal. That fear blinded him. In Half-Blood Prince, Severus Snape stands in Malfoy Manor, swearing an unbreakable vow to protect Draco and, if necessary, to kill Dumbledore. Bellatrix Lestrange demands to know why Voldemort trusts him, but the truth is he doesn't. He only uses Snape because he has to. Voldemort's cold eyes never stop watching. "You are a talented man, Severus," he says with a smile. But behind that smile lies doubt, and doubt killed him. Snape was the most dangerous kind of man, one who could lie to your face and make you believe he was on your side. But instead of recognizing the value of that talent, Voldemort locked Snape out. He never told him about the final horcrux. He never shared his real plans for Harry. In Deathly Hallows, Voldemort keeps the Elder Wand secret. He never even considers that Snape might have been loyal to someone else. He thinks he sees everything. He sees nothing. If Voldemort had trusted Snape, he would have known that Lily Evans mattered more to him than life itself. He would have seen the way Snape looked at Harry, not with hatred, but with pain. He would have asked why Dumbledore kept Snape so close, but Voldemort, always so sure of his own genius, never asked questions he feared the answers to. Instead, he let Snape walk between two worlds: a Death Eater by name, a protector by choice. When Voldemort slit Snape's throat beside the lake, he thought he was severing a loose end. Instead, he destroyed the only person who could have told him why the wand refused to obey. "Look at me," Snape whispered as he died, not to Voldemort, but to Harry. In that one line, the lie fell apart. Voldemort had always believed fear controlled men, but Snape was never ruled by fear. He was ruled by love, and Voldemort never saw it coming. Number 14, Cornelius Fudge, denying Voldemort's return. When Harry Potter returned from the graveyard in the Goblet of Fire, shaken and bleeding, he brought with him a terrifying truth. Voldemort was back. But Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, refused to listen. He stood in the hospital wing, pale and sweating, as Dumbledore calmly laid out the facts. Fudge's hands trembled, but his pride held firm. "He's not back," he whispered. "He can't be." He looked not at the evidence, not at Harry's torn body, but at the implications for his career. The truth was too dangerous for him. It would mean panic, disruption, the collapse of his polished image. So he chose to lie, not to Voldemort, but to his own people. That decision changed everything. While Dumbledore tried to rally the Order of the Phoenix in secret, Voldemort grew stronger by the day. Death Eaters slipped from Azkaban, their names erased from reports. Attacks on Muggleborns were called isolated incidents. Fudge clung to a fantasy while the Dark Lord built an army. His ministry fed the press lies, turned the prophet into a puppet, and labelled Harry as delusional. Even Percy Weasley, blinded by ambition, sided with the ministry against his own family. The wizarding world didn't prepare for war, they prepared for a cover-up. One night, Fudge sent Dolores Umbridge to Hogwarts, not to protect the students, but to silence Dumbledore and control the narrative. "Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged," she told them with a smile. And while she handed out cruel detentions and interrogated children, Voldemort quietly reclaimed his network. In the Department of Mysteries, the truth exploded, literally. Death Eaters, including Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange, attacked teenagers in the ministry itself. Fudge arrived just in time to see Voldemort vanish in a burst of flame. His face turned grey. He had seen it, finally, and yet it was too late. By the time Fudge publicly admitted Voldemort's return, the wizarding world had already paid the price. "He's back," Fudge said hoarsely in Order of the Phoenix. One sentence, 1 year too late. The damage was done, not by Death Eaters alone, but by cowardice in power. Cornelius Fudge may not have cast a single curse, but his denial allowed the greatest evil to rise unchecked. Number 15. Voldemort, accidentally making Harry a horcrux. The night was filled with terror and prophecy. A child had been born, and in the shadowy corners of the wizarding world, Lord Voldemort made a decision that would become the beginning of his downfall. This decision was not part of his grand strategy, nor was it guided by the cold precision with which he executed most of his dark plans. It was, ironically, a spontaneous reaction, a violent act fueled by paranoia and a desperate need to maintain power. In attempting to kill Harry Potter, Voldemort inadvertently created a horcrux within him, a boy who would grow up to become his greatest threat. For a man who feared death more than anything, Voldemort had dedicated his life to finding ways to defy it. His soul, already mutilated by the murders he had committed, had been split multiple times and hidden in carefully selected objects. The diary of Tom Riddle, Marvolo Gaunt's ring, Salazar Slytherin's locket, Helga Hufflepuff's cup, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, and later Nagini, his loyal serpent. Each horcrux was created with cruel precision and hidden with obsessive cunning. Yet the unintentional horcrux, Harry Potter, was not planned, not calculated, not protected. It was a raw, uncontrolled explosion of dark magic in the nursery at Godric's Hollow. This slip in Voldemort's otherwise meticulous strategy was more than just a magical accident. It was a catastrophic oversight. The prophecy had said, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches." And in that moment, Voldemort made a fatal choice. He acted out of fear, not reason. Instead of waiting to understand the full meaning of the prophecy, he rushed to eliminate a baby. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. In trying to destroy the threat before it could grow, he planted the seed of his own destruction. The creation of a horcrux requires murder, a deliberate act of soul-splitting, and a magical container. But when Voldemort's killing curse backfired, rebounded by the protection Lily Potter had given her son, the Dark Lord was shattered, not just physically but spiritually. Part of his soul, untethered and lost, latched onto the only living thing in the room, Harry. "He took your blood believing it would strengthen him," Dumbledore once explained, "but it tethered him to life while you lived." In a grotesque twist of fate, the boy became the vessel. This connection gave Harry powers he neither wanted nor understood. He could feel Voldemort's emotions, glimpse into his thoughts, even speak Parseltongue, a gift of the Slytherin line that should have been impossible. "There's a reason he can speak Parseltongue," Dumbledore told Snape. "There's a reason he can look into Lord Voldemort's mind. A part of Voldemort lives inside him." What Voldemort never anticipated was that by binding Harry to himself, he gave the boy a roadmap to his own soul. As years passed, the connection grew stronger. Harry's dreams were no longer his own. He witnessed Voldemort's fury, his triumphs, his anguish. It became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave Harry and the Order of the Phoenix crucial insight into the Dark Lord's movements. On the other, it exposed Harry to the overwhelming darkness of a man who had extinguished every trace of humanity within himself. Voldemort, blind in his arrogance, never suspected that the very child he tried to kill was watching him from the shadows of his own mind. The irony is cruel and poetic. Voldemort, who believed himself above all, who reduced others to pawns and tools, had unknowingly made himself vulnerable to the very person he deemed unworthy. He had underestimated the power of love, of human connection, of sacrifice. The same child whose mother died to protect him now carried within him the echo of Voldemort's own soul. And it was this very echo that made it possible for Harry to understand his enemy so intimately. Perhaps the most damning element of this decision was that it was fueled by obsession. Voldemort could not bear the idea that anyone, especially a child of Muggle-born heritage, could be destined to defeat him. He viewed Harry not as a person, but as a threat to be annihilated. This obsessive need to control fate, to dominate prophecy, clouded his judgment. He never once considered the possibility that by seeking to destroy what he feared, he was empowering it. He poured his hatred into that curse, and with it tore away part of his own essence. Voldemort was always a man of control. He controlled his Death Eaters through fear, controlled magical creatures through force, and controlled his image through terror. Yet, he could never control Harry. The horcrux within the boy created a magical bond that transcended all his schemes. It was not a leash, but a window that let Harry see into his soul and eventually learn how to destroy every last fragment of it. The prophecy did not lie. Kate, the power the Dark Lord knows not, was not just love. It was empathy, intuition, the very qualities Voldemort had discarded in his pursuit of immortality. Even more damning is how this bond blinded Voldemort. In the Deathly Hallows, he believed the Elder Wand would make him invincible. He never suspected that it answered to Harry. He never realized that Harry was a living key to his own defeat. He was so convinced of his own supremacy, he could not see the trap he had laid for himself. His fixation on the Hallows, his confidence in his horcruxes, and his utter disregard for the nature of the human soul, all of it led to a final confrontation in the Great Hall, where he stood exposed and alone. Number 16, Nagini participating directly in battles. The Battle of Hogwarts raged with unrelenting chaos, spells clashing like thunderbolts, and the cries of wounded students echoing through the shattered halls. Among the chaos, a serpentine shape slithered with calculated menace, her yellow eyes gleaming with something far more sinister than survival. Nagini, Lord Voldemort's most beloved companion and, more crucially, his final horcrux, did not simply lurk in the shadows that night. She surged into the heart of battle, exposed and vulnerable, her master's last hope at immortality hanging by a scale. It was a decision that would ultimately unravel everything. This wasn't an isolated moment of madness. Voldemort had long demonstrated a baffling willingness to expose Nagini to danger. At Godric's Hollow, he allowed her to take the lead, using her as bait for Harry Potter. In the Department of Mysteries, he deployed her again, lurking nearby to strike, but nowhere was his recklessness more damning than during the final confrontation at Hogwarts. The snake! You need to kill the snake, Dumbledore's portrait had urged Harry in The Deathly Hallows, underscoring the singular importance of this creature. Nagini wasn't merely a pet or a weapon. She was the vessel of a soul fragment, his last. By the time the battle reached its crescendo, Voldemort had entrusted Nagini's protection to Severus Snape, locking her in a protective magical sphere, suspended and gliding eerily beside the potions master. But even this safeguard wasn't enough to prevent disaster. In an act as poetic as it was brutal, Neville Longbottom, the once bumbling boy who had grown into a lion-hearted fighter, drew the sword of Gryffindor and struck the fatal blow. "The snake's dead!" someone cried in disbelief, and with her death, the last of Voldemort's horcruxes perished. The question haunts any careful reader of the series. Why would Voldemort risk so much? Why bring Nagini into a battlefield teeming with curses, flying debris, and determined enemies? A strategist, even a desperate one, would protect their most vital asset. And yet, Voldemort did the opposite. He paraded Nagini through the heart of the conflict, effectively placing his immortality in a gilded glass case, daring fate, or worse, daring the boy who had evaded death so many times to destroy it. This carelessness is jarring when contrasted with the elaborate protections surrounding his earlier horcruxes. Tom Riddle's diary was hidden under Lucius Malfoy's care for years. Marvolo Gaunt's ring was buried deep and cursed with lethal magic. Helga Hufflepuff's cup rested in the depths of Gringotts, a vault designed to be impenetrable. Even Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem was secreted in the Room of Requirement, lost to the world, and yet Nagini was left to slither in plain sight, as if Voldemort had forgotten the lessons of caution he had so painstakingly followed. Some might argue that Voldemort's growing desperation led to this decision. As his horcruxes fell one by one, first the diary, then the ring, the locket, the cup, and the diadem, his sense of invincibility may have frayed, and with it, his judgment. But this theory doesn't fully explain his behavior. Desperation often breeds paranoia, not bold exposure. Voldemort was paranoid enough to suspect betrayal from every quarter, to hide in the forest, to torture those who disappointed him. Why not protect Nagini with equal fervor? Perhaps the answer lies in Voldemort's fatal arrogance. From the beginning, he dismissed love, loyalty, and friendship as weaknesses. He believed himself untouchable. He saw his followers not as comrades but as tools. And in his twisted logic, Nagini was more than a horcrux. She was an extension of himself. He spoke to her in Parseltongue, confided in her, used her as a weapon of both fear and vengeance. In the Goblet of Fire, we see her slither beside him at the Riddle House, coiled near the hearth like a dark prophecy. To him, she wasn't something that could be lost, because he didn't believe she could be touched. But Nagini was touched. Neville Longbottom, wielding the very sword that had once destroyed another horcrux, the locket, drew strength not from hatred, but from courage. The moment was nothing short of legendary. Voldemort, distracted in his final duel with Harry, never anticipated that Neville, the boy who had lost his parents to Death Eaters, would rise to strike the death blow to his last protection. As the book recounts, with a single stroke, Neville sliced off the great snake's head. It flew high into the air as the body slumped to the ground, and just like that, the thread of immortality snapped. The irony is painful. In Voldemort's quest to transcend death, he anchored pieces of his soul to objects he thought untouchable. But in giving Nagini autonomy, in allowing her to prowl and strike, he tethered his immortality to motion, to unpredictability, to risk. He turned his final horcrux into a participant in war, not a hidden relic. He gave the storm a target, and the storm answered. The death of Nagini wasn't merely symbolic, it was strategic. It marked the irreversible collapse of Voldemort's false invincibility. Without her, he was mortal. And when Harry finally faced him, wand in hand and soul intact, Voldemort was just a man. A powerful, fearsome man, but one who could die. The book spares no dramatic tension in the final clash. Tom Riddle hit the floor with a mundane finality. The magic that had sustained him evaporated. The horcruxes were gone. The vessel was empty. It's difficult not to see Voldemort's choice as a miscalculation born of his core flaw, his belief that fear could control fate. He thought Nagini could strike terror and survive it. He thought a magical barrier around her would be enough. He never imagined that a Gryffindor with a sword, a heart full of fury, and a legacy of pain could end it all in a single arc of steel. His error wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. He failed to understand that love, loyalty, and sacrifice had a magic of their own, one far older than his twisted sorcery. Number 17, Dolores Umbridge, using the horcrux in interrogations. Dolores Umbridge sat at the heart of the ministry like a bloated spider, spinning webs of cruelty under the guise of law and order. Her pink cardigan and saccharine smile disguised a venom that seeped through every floor of the building during her tenure. When she was handed control over the Muggle-born Registration Commission, the ministry cloaked its actions in official language, but what transpired behind closed doors was little more than sanctioned torment. Among her arsenal of tools was one that should have never been brought into proximity with innocent people. Salazar Slytherin's locket, a horcrux, steeped in a dark legacy that Umbridge either willfully ignored or failed to comprehend. The locket had already begun to warp the mind of Ronald Weasley when Harry, Ron, and Hermione carried it during their journey. Even just wearing it around the neck was enough to magnify his insecurities, provoke paranoia, and feed an inner voice of bitterness that slowly replaced rational thought. Ron, who had always been loyal, became cold and resentful. He turned against Harry in a moment of weakness and stormed off into the unknown, only to return with difficulty and shame. That was the power of the horcrux, and this was the very object Dolores Umbridge wore openly as a badge of supposed authority, pressing its aura onto every trembling soul she summoned into her office. The courtroom Umbridge operated in was already terrifying. Dark stone walls, cold lighting, and dementors circling like vultures gave it the feel of an execution chamber. She sat high above her victims, her voice honeyed with mock sympathy as she interrogated Muggleborns whose only crime was their lineage. When Mary Cattermole stood accused, trembling and clutching the sides of the chair, the locket hung around Umbridge's neck like a silent sentinel of doom. Its influence twisted the room further, layering fear with a creeping madness that no decree could explain away. The Horcrux whispered, perhaps only to those most vulnerable, and for many it was enough to make them break. It was not enough for Umbridge to question the heritage of these witches and wizards. She had to humiliate them, erase their magic, and brand them as thieves. "You are not a witch," she declared, disregarding the magic that pulsed in the terrified souls before her. "You stole your wand!" But her authority came not from truth or justice, it came from darkness wrapped around her throat. The locket, once belonging to Slytherin himself, carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul. In Umbridge's hands it became more than a symbol, it became a weapon of psychological warfare. Dolores Umbridge never truly understood what she was wearing. To her it was a piece of jewelry with noble origins, a Slytherin heirloom that affirmed her place within the elite of the wizarding world. She clung to it as validation, blind to the rot it spread. Had she known the locket contained the soul of the Dark Lord himself, would she have discarded it? Unlikely. Umbridge was not merely cruel. She was ambitious, in the worst sense, drunk on the power that seeped from the object she adorned herself with. The Horcrux did not corrupt her. It found in her a willing host. Under the influence of the locket, her sadism became more methodical, her decisions colder. "She's enjoying this," Harry observed from under the invisibility cloak. And she was. There was no remorse in her eyes, only triumph. Each terrified witch or wizard was another brick in the fortress of her ideology, a world where power belonged to the pure and the ministry dictated truth. But the irony was sharp and bitter. While she preached purity, she bore a fragment of the most tainted soul that ever walked the earth. The consequences of this reckless union between bureaucracy and black magic were profound. The air in the ministry grew heavier, not just from fear, but from an undefinable dread. Workers avoided her corridor, detainees whispered of hallucinations, voices in their ears, thoughts that didn't belong to them. The locket pulsed, fed by their pain. And Dolores, surrounded by trembling hands and false confessions, continued her crusade with unblinking resolve. The line between justice and horror vanished under her watch, and the locket glistened with every stolen truth. One might argue that Dolores Umbridge did not know what she was doing, that she was merely a puppet of the ministry. But such arguments ignore the choice she made to wear the locket, to use it during interrogations, and to gaze upon it as if it were a crown. She wielded power without knowledge and authority without wisdom. Worse still, she did not ask questions. In the world she built, questions were a threat. The locket did not need to speak to her. Her mind was already aligned with its core tenets: domination, fear, superiority. The theft of the Horcrux marked the end of her illusion of control. When Harry stunned her and Hermione tore the locket from her neck, it was as if a thread had been severed. The object that had clung to her so tightly, as if feeding on her cruelty, was finally ripped away, but not before it had done irreversible damage. It had been placed around the necks of the broken and the accused, breathing despair into those who were already near collapse. For those who endured it, the trauma lingered long after the locket disappeared into the forest. Had Voldemort known that his soul fragment was being paraded through the Ministry by a woman in kitten-covered cardigans, would he have laughed or raged? Perhaps both. But in truth, the horcrux served his cause well under Umbridge's care. It sowed chaos, it punished the innocent. It disguised evil as order. And it made Dolores a vessel for something far greater and far more malevolent than she could comprehend. She believed she was cleansing the wizarding world. In reality, she was opening its veins. Number 18 Death Eaters, attacking Bill and Fleur's wedding. The air above the burrow shimmered with magic that summer evening. Lanterns floated among the trees, laughter echoed under a pink-tinged sky, and the music of fiddles wrapped around the gathered crowd like a charm. The wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour was meant to be a rare moment of joy in the rising darkness of war. Yet that illusion shattered with a single silver-blue Patronus gliding into the tent, Kingsley Shacklebolt's lynx bearing the words that dropped the temperature like ice. "The Ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming." It was in that very moment that the Death Eaters chose to strike. But instead of sowing terror, they revealed the cracks in their own plan. The timing of the attack seemed perfect. The Order of the Phoenix had gathered in one place. Harry Potter, the greatest threat to Voldemort's power, was standing exposed, albeit under Polyjuice Potion. It was a golden opportunity to crush resistance and seize the boy who lived before he could vanish again. And yet, within minutes of the alarm, chaos had overtaken the attackers. Guests disapparated, curses flew, and the tent erupted into screaming confusion. Despite the bold entrance, the Death Eaters achieved almost nothing. Harry, Ron, and Hermione escaped under the nose of every agent Voldemort trusted. The Weasleys, central figures in the rebellion, were unharmed. The attack left no bodies, only questions. This wasn't simply a failure in execution, it was a failure in vision. The Death Eaters, emboldened by their new grip on the Ministry, mistook visibility for power. They believed a loud, public display of violence would intimidate the wizarding world into submission. Instead, it exposed them as tactically unsound. There was no containment strategy, no effort to secure perimeters, no backup teams to intercept escapees. For a group once feared for their precision and ruthlessness, they seemed woefully unprepared. Even the Muggle police could have managed a better raid. Hermione, thinking quickly, apparated herself, Ron, and Harry to Tottenham Court Road. It was a random civilian location. If the Death Eaters had been truly organized, a network of trackers would have predicted and intercepted such a move. But the trio slipped away unmarked. In fact, they were not even pursued immediately. In the Deathly Hallows, the narrative shifts directly to the trio regrouping, not running, not hiding, but quietly strategizing. "They didn't follow us," Hermione said, breathless but astonished. For enemies hailed as terror incarnate, the Death Eaters left more people alive than dead that night. It's baffling that this assault was prioritized over strikes on actual strongholds. Grimmauld Place remained untouched. Hogwarts had not yet fallen. The goblins still controlled Gringotts. Crucial magical records lay undisturbed in the Department of Mysteries. Instead of seizing artifacts or destroying havens of resistance, Voldemort's followers disrupted a family celebration. For what? To embarrass Arthur Weasley? To scatter confetti and fear in equal measure? Strategic warfare demands more than dramatics. It demands purpose. That, evidently, was in short supply. Even Voldemort himself seemed absent from the planning. His fingerprints weren't on this operation. He would later take personal charge of interrogations, of battles, of the slow psychological torture of Harry through his horcruxes. But the wedding attack bore the hallmark of eager subordinates trying to impress a boss they didn't fully understand. Yaxley, Travers, and Roll were capable of cruelty, but not of subtlety. Their recklessness risked revealing too much. And it did. For the first time, the wizarding public realized that Voldemort had returned in full strength. But rather than kneel, many began to fight. It is telling that even Rita Skeeter, the tabloid queen of wizarding journalism, used the attack in her whispers and innuendos. Her unauthorized biography of Dumbledore suggested with acidic wit that weddings are rarely the ideal venues for dark, Lord-approved announcements. The mocking tone spread like wildfire. Humor, especially dark, subversive humor, became a shield for the frightened and a dagger for the resistance. The Ministry's fall was terrifying, yes, but the spectacle at the Burrow painted the new regime as theatrical fools rather than omnipotent gods. The most curious outcome, however, was what followed. The Order disbanded into cells, communications became secretive and magical. Dumbledore's army reactivated underground. Resistance did not shrink, it expanded. Families who had stayed neutral now had a vision of what Voldemort's rule looked like. Weddings turned into war zones, children targeted, friends hunted in broad daylight. The moral clarity of the moment was searing. If this was the future under Voldemort, then neutrality became complicity. The attack at the Burrow was a political gift to the opposition. The trio's survival was particularly damaging to the Death Eaters. Every failed attempt to capture Harry added to his myth. Undesirable number one became not just a Ministry term, but a badge of honor. With each escape, his story grew teeth. Children whispered about him in corridors. His name became hope. Had the Death Eaters succeeded in ambushing and killing him at the wedding, the war might have ended swiftly. Instead, he vanished, not as a fugitive, but as a ghost in the machine, moving quietly toward his purpose. Fred and George, always the first to see the emotional undercurrents of war, capitalized on the event in their own way. At Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they began selling enchanted confetti that screamed, "They're coming!" when thrown, a direct parody of Kingsley's warning. Mockery was resistance too. The more absurd the enemy looked, the more emboldened the people became. The Death Eaters didn't just lose a tactical battle. They lost narrative control. And in any war, stories are weapons. The Ministry, now under Pius Thicknesser, tried to spin the wedding attack as a victory. But even within their own propaganda, inconsistencies bled through. No arrests, no recovered artifacts, no casualties worth printing. The official statement read like a poorly written play. Ministry officials responded swiftly to unlicensed magical activity near Ottery St. Catchpole. No civilians were harmed. It sounded less like a triumph and more like a clean-up. The message was clear. They had arrived, made noise, and left empty-handed. By contrast, Harry, Ron, and Hermione immediately took action after the escape. Within days, they infiltrated the Ministry, stole a horcrux, and escaped again. Their precision and daring only underscored the incompetence of their enemies. The contrast could not have been more damning. While the Death Eaters crashed parties, teenagers were dismantling ancient dark magic. Voldemort's forces weren't just inefficient, they were embarrassingly short-sighted. Even the symbolic damage failed. Weddings in wizarding culture are sacrosanct, a union not only of people, but of magical lineages, alliances, and hope. By attacking a wedding, the Death Eaters committed a taboo that alienated even conservative pure-blood families. The Carrows, known for their cruelty, reportedly objected privately to the optics. The damage wasn't just magical, it was social. It turned whispers into speeches, fears into rallies. One wonders if the attack was meant as revenge, not strategy. The Weasleys had long been thorns in the side of Voldemort's ideology. Poor, tolerant, defiantly pro-Muggle. To disrupt their most joyful day was to make a statement of personal hatred. But wars are not won on vendettas, they are won on leverage, on control, on silence, where noise would fail. And in that moment the Death Eaters screamed, and the world saw through them. In the end, the wedding attack reads like a tantrum dressed in robes. It was flashy, loud, and emotionally satisfying for its perpetrators, but devoid of purpose. For all their dark glamour, the Death Eaters revealed themselves not as brilliant tacticians, but as men in masks chasing ghosts. The real war, quiet and relentless, was being fought elsewhere, in forests, in vaults, in memories, and with every misstep like the burrow attack, Voldemort edged closer to defeat. Not in battle, but in meaning. Number 19, Voldemort killing Snape without understanding the Elder Wand. It was at the boathouse near the Black Lake where Voldemort sealed one of his most fatal mistakes. Cloaked in his quest for absolute mastery, he faced Severus Snape and made a decision that not only betrayed a man who had served him closely, but also demonstrated the Dark Lord's deepest flaw, his inability to understand the true nature of magic beyond brute power. Voldemort, holding the Elder Wand in his pale hand, chose to murder Snape, believing this act would bind the wand's loyalty to him. It was a scene marked by cold logic and violent ignorance, for Voldemort was wrong about everything that mattered. Voldemort had assumed that because Snape had killed Dumbledore, the previous master of the Elder Wand, Snape must have inherited its allegiance. This was the logic of a man who saw loyalty as a matter of killing and dominance, not of defeat or choice. He failed to grasp a crucial truth. The Elder Wand's allegiance passed not to the killer, but to the one who bested its previous master. In the Deathly Hallows, this subtle but critical detail is revealed when Harry explains, "The wand's more clever than you, Voldemort. It belongs to the wizard who killed its last owner. You killed Snape, but the wand still isn't yours. It never was. The wand belongs to me." By this point, it was too late. Voldemort's magical ignorance had already doomed him. Snape had never been the true master of the Elder Wand. The chain of allegiance had taken a different path, one that Voldemort, obsessed with bloodshed and finality, had not even considered. When Draco Malfoy disarmed Dumbledore at the Astronomy Tower in Half-Blood Prince, the wand's loyalty shifted to him. Harry, in turn, overpowered Draco at Malfoy Manor, making Harry the wand's rightful master, a fact Voldemort never understood. His logic stopped at murder, never contemplating the nuances of magical allegiance. It was this lack of comprehension that turned his power into weakness. The irony is bitter and poetic. Voldemort, in murdering Snape, thought he was eliminating a potential threat while simultaneously gaining complete control over the Elder Wand. But in doing so, he discarded the only person who could have explained to him the wand's true nature. Snape, despite his double life, was a brilliant and deeply informed wizard, especially skilled in magical theory. Had Voldemort sought understanding rather than control, he might have paused to consider Snape's knowledge. Instead, he silenced a man who held more wisdom than he could ever realize. The scene itself is brutal and stripped of mercy. Snape is attacked by Voldemort's snake, Nagini, locked inside a magical sphere, left to die slowly and painfully. It is a death without dignity, a rewardless end for a man who had endured unbearable isolation and risk. Snape's final moments are not just tragic, but symbolically rich, the blood leaking from his neck like the truth slipping away from a world too blind to see it. In killing Snape, Voldemort did not just err tactically, he severed a line to knowledge, nuance, and subtlety, qualities that had once made him a formidable student at Hogwarts. What makes this moment so devastating is that it was avoidable. Voldemort's decision was not made out of necessity, but out of an arrogant miscalculation. He believed himself beyond question, infallible in his judgments. Yet here the Dark Lord acted on false assumptions, exposing the rot at the heart of his intelligence. He had studied the Elder Wand, had sought it obsessively, but failed to appreciate the ancient and arcane rules that governed it. For all his terror and might, Voldemort remained at his core a man who never truly understood the depth of magic. Harry, a teenager, guided more by instinct and heart than formal knowledge, saw more clearly. When he stood in the great hall, wand in hand, and revealed the wand's lineage, it became painfully obvious that Voldemort had been outmaneuvered by someone he always considered inferior. The Elder Wand recognized its true master not through lineage or power, but through an act of disarming. The simplicity of the act, Draco taking Dumbledore's wand, stood in stark contrast to Voldemort's theatrical violence. That contrast marked the fundamental difference between understanding and force. The Elder Wand was not a weapon of brutality. It was a relic of deep and mysterious craftsmanship, older than the concept of ownership through blood. Its loyalty could not be taken, it had to be earned, and Voldemort's every move proved he was unworthy. When he raised the wand to strike Harry in the Forbidden Forest, it resisted. It only obeyed in form, not in will. That defiance grew with every spell Voldemort cast, and when the final duel came, the wand betrayed him, refusing to kill its true master. It turned back on him, finishing what he had started with Snape, the unraveling of his power. Voldemort's downfall was not written in prophecy alone. It was etched in his choices, each one reflecting his fundamental misunderstanding of magic's true essence. The murder of Snape was the culmination of that misunderstanding. It was not just a tactical error, it was symbolic of everything Voldemort failed to grasp, that loyalty is not forged in blood, that mastery cannot be stolen, and that violence is not the same as victory. In his quest to possess the most powerful wand, he discarded the wisdom that might have saved him. Snape's death also serves as a mirror to Voldemort's character. The Dark Lord believed betrayal to be the ultimate crime, yet he committed it without hesitation. He suspected Snape, distrusted him, yet still relied on him until the very end. That duality of suspicion and dependence reveals the shaky foundation of Voldemort's rule. He ruled through fear, not trust, and so he could never build the kind of loyalty that magic like the Elder Wand demanded. Snape's silent endurance, his secret sacrifices, all remained invisible to a master who saw only surface and submission. The tragedy of Snape's death resonates more deeply because it is entwined with Voldemort's hubris. Snape had walked the tightrope of loyalty between Dumbledore and Voldemort with unmatched skill, risking everything for a cause only a few knew he served. Yet his death came not from exposure or betrayal, but from being misjudged by a man too blind to see who truly held the strings. Voldemort, in killing Snape, destroyed not just a servant, but a shield that had for years kept some measure of balance within his chaotic empire. In the end, the Elder Wand was never Voldemort's to claim. It tolerated his grip, but it never accepted his command. Like a living being, the wand recoiled from unworthy hands. Harry's final victory was not one of brute force, but of rightfulness. He had not killed for the wand, had not schemed or plotted. He had simply disarmed, defended, survived. The magic recognized that. And when the final spell rebounded, when Voldemort was struck down by his own curse, it was not just fate or prophecy, it was justice, exacted by a wand that chose its master with ancient clarity. It is tempting to see Voldemort as the most dangerous wizard of his age, but in the end he was undone by his own ignorance. He never took the time to understand the very tools he sought to control. He saw Snape as an obstacle, not a resource. He viewed the Elder Wand as a weapon, not a being of choice. His downfall, then, was less about Harry's strength and more about his own blindness. The greatest enemy Voldemort ever faced was not the boy who lived, it was the truth he refused to learn. This misjudgment cost him everything. It cost him the trust of his followers, the strength of his own command, and the loyalty of the wand he believed would make him invincible. In killing Snape, he severed his own path to power. The blood spilled in the boathouse was not just Snape's, it was the symbolic bleeding out of Voldemort's reign, a death born of arrogance, an act driven by miscalculation, and a fate sealed not by prophecy, but by pride. Number 20, Death Eaters torturing Neville at Hogwarts. When the Carrows arrived at Hogwarts, they brought with them more than just the stench of Death Eater cruelty. They brought fear, control, and punishment disguised as education. Amicus Carrow taught the twisted version of defense against the dark arts, where students practiced Cruciatus curses on one another. His sister, Alecto, poisoned the minds of children in Muggle studies, preaching hate as if it were scripture. In such a regime, a wise oppressor would silence opposition quickly, crush any spirit of rebellion before it could spread. But the Carrows did not possess the cunning of true tyrants. They had brute force and arrogance, and that made them blind to the threat that stood in plain sight: Neville Longbottom. Neville was not the boy who once fumbled with a remembrall or forgot passwords. The shy, awkward child had vanished, hardened by loss and guided by purpose. With Harry gone, Ron vanished, and Hermione nowhere in sight. The responsibility to guard the soul of Hogwarts fell unexpectedly into Neville's hands. From the very first days of the Carrows' reign, he resisted. He defied their orders, refused to curse his classmates, and bore the consequences without flinching. This, to the Carrows, was insolence that demanded punishment, not elimination. And in that failure to act decisively, they planted the seeds of their own downfall. The Carrows believed pain would break him. They used public humiliation as spectacle, dragging Neville to the front of the classroom, striking him with curses that left welts and bruises. Sometimes they threw him into solitary detention. Other times they forced him to watch others suffer. "He got this one for asking how much Muggle blood you need to be pure," Neville once explained to Harry, pointing at a gash across his cheek. But they misunderstood the core of resistance. Pain does not extinguish courage, it reveals it. Every blow Neville received, every insult hurled at him, only fanned the flames of quiet rebellion among his peers. Students began to whisper his name as if it were a spell of protection. Younger students looked at him not with pity, but with reverence. He became something more than a classmate. He became a symbol. When the Carrows forced students to cast Cruciatus, Neville refused again and again. Each refusal was a torch in the dark, and soon others began to follow. The Carrows, consumed by their need to dominate, failed to see that they were building Neville's legend, not crushing it. Instead of silencing dissent, the Carrows fed it. Neville, alongside Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood, resurrected Dumbledore's army. But this time, it was not just a secret club of students practicing spells, it was a movement. They sabotaged dark arts lessons, protected younger students, and communicated in code. Room of Requirement became their sanctuary, its magic responding to their need. They slept there, planned there, survived there. And every morning, Neville walked the halls, bruised but unbroken, daring others to stand with him. What made the Carrows' error so grave was that they mistook submission for success. Most students obeyed out of fear. But even fear has limits. Watching Neville stand after every curse, wipe the blood from his chin, and stare back at his abusers without lowering his eyes, it did something irreversible to the student body. It fractured the illusion of Death Eater invincibility. They began to ask questions. If Neville could endure, why couldn't they resist too? The Carrows could have exiled him, as they did with others. They could have silenced him permanently, but their pride convinced them they were in control. They believed Neville's suffering would serve as a warning. Instead, it was a rallying cry. His pain became their protest. Even students who had never cared for him before now saw him as a leader. The boy who once shrank in fear of Professor Snape had become the quiet general of a student uprising. By the time Harry returned to Hogwarts, the castle was already stirring with rebellion. The battle had not yet begun, but the ground was tilled, the roots of resistance deep. It was Neville who met Harry at the entrance, not as a sidekick, but as the keeper of the last safe place within Hogwarts. "We've been holding it together," he said, as if it were the simplest task in the world. The truth was far more complex. Holding it together meant risking death every day. It meant choosing integrity over safety and hope over fear. And yet he had done it under the noses of the Carrows. When the final battle arrived, Neville did not retreat into the background. He stood at the front lines, wielding the sword of Gryffindor, the very blade that had once slain the basilisk. And it was in that climactic moment that the full cost of the Carrows' cruelty was revealed. Had they removed him early on, had they seen the danger in his courage, perhaps Nagini would have lived, perhaps the final horcrux would have survived, but they didn't. And so Neville, standing amid fire and ruin, raised the sword and cleaved through the snake, severing the last piece of Voldemort's soul. It was a death that echoed with poetic justice. The snake, a symbol of Voldemort's power and terror, destroyed by the very student he had underestimated. Then Neville broke free, ran across the room, and as the snake reared up, slicing through the air, he swung the sword with all his might and cut off its head, the book narrates, delivering one of the most triumphant moments in the entire series. It was not Harry, not Dumbledore's wisdom, not a prophecy, but Neville's endurance that dealt the final blow to Voldemort's immortality. In their arrogance, the Death Eaters failed to understand that repression fuels rebellion. Every act of cruelty committed against Neville made him more dangerous. They handed him a story, a cause, a reason to fight. And more than that, they gave everyone watching a reason to believe that even in a world ruled by fear, defiance was possible. Neville became the thread that bound Hogwarts together. Where Death Eaters imposed isolation, he built unity. The tragedy of the Carrows was not only their brutality, it was their stupidity. They were not visionaries of evil, they were bureaucrats of suffering, applying pain like policy, blind to the consequences. And in that blindness, they missed what even Voldemort himself eventually saw, that some enemies cannot be broken with whips or curses. They grow stronger with every act of cruelty, they evolve in the fire. Neville's transformation was not an accident. It was the product of prolonged injustice. In many ways, he became the answer to Voldemort's perversion of Hogwarts. The castle that had once been a place of wonder turned into a cage, but even then it produced warriors. It produced Neville Longbottom. Had Voldemort's forces shown restraint, had they used cunning rather than brute force, they might have quelled the resistance, but they didn't. They left Neville alive, bleeding but breathing, and in doing so, they left the match that would ignite the flames. Every dictatorship fears the symbol it cannot kill. Neville became that symbol. In his refusal to kneel, he gave others a reason to rise. While the Carrows screamed commands and spat curses, he walked silently, bearing the weight of resistance with the quiet grace of someone who knew he was fighting for something greater than himself. In time, it wasn't the dark mark that inspired fear. It was the possibility that students might whisper Neville's name in the dark and find courage. In the end, the Death Eaters' greatest mistake was assuming that power lies only in domination. They saw Neville as weak because he lacked the hunger for control, but true strength often grows in silence, in refusal, in the unwillingness to become what you hate. And so, as the dust of battle settled and Hogwarts began to rebuild, it was not the Carrows who were remembered, nor the fear they sowed. It was Neville standing tall amid the wreckage, the sword still glinting in his hand, the boy who had no prophecy but became a legend all the same. Number 21, Voldemort, failing to understand the power of love. Voldemort's greatest error was not a miscast spell or an overlooked prophecy. It was his utter rejection of something he never understood: love. In a world built upon wands, incantations, and magical bloodlines, Tom Riddle believed that emotion, affection, and loyalty were irrelevant distractions inferior to fear and domination. From the orphanage where he first tasted power to the halls of Hogwarts where he sharpened his cruelty, Voldemort viewed love as a flaw in others, a weakness to be exploited, not a force to be reckoned with. But it was precisely this ignorance that would seal his fate, leaving him powerless in the face of something he could never grasp. He never questioned why Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of his age, repeatedly warned him of the power of love. He mocked it. He believed strength was measured by how much one could control, not how much one could protect. When he murdered Lily Potter, he didn't realize he was initiating the magic that would one day destroy him. He saw Lily's act of sacrifice not as an act of power, but of stupidity. Yet it was this sacrifice that infused Harry with a protection no curse could penetrate. To have been loved so deeply, even though the person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever, Dumbledore said. Voldemort never paused to consider why the killing curse failed on a child's forehead. Tom Riddle's transformation into Lord Voldemort was not just a shift in name, but a deliberate erasure of his humanity. He severed every tie to others. No friends, no family, no attachments. He crafted horcruxes to fracture his soul, believing immortality was worth the price of isolation. But what he saw as clarity was, in fact, blindness. He could not comprehend that the power he craved was not hidden in ancient objects, but in simple acts of selflessness. Lily's arms around her baby, those not relics or runes, shattered the most powerful curse in magical history. When Harry chose to return to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, knowing he was walking to his death, he was replicating the very act Voldemort once dismissed. Harry's readiness to die for others, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, made him stronger than any spell Voldemort had ever mastered. Voldemort wielded the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand ever made, yet he could not defeat a boy armed with nothing but love. In that moment, Harry echoed his mother's sacrifice, and once again, Voldemort's curse could not win. It rebounded, not because of technicality, but because Voldemort had violated a deeper law of magic he never bothered to learn. Even when he possessed Harry in the Department of Mysteries, Voldemort was baffled by the pain he felt. Harry's heart, filled with grief over Sirius's death, burned with such raw emotion that Voldemort had to retreat. "You're the weak one," Harry would later say, "and you'll never know love or friendship." Voldemort could not stay inside someone whose soul pulsed with feeling. It scorched him, not because love is gentle, but because love is fierce. It fights. Voldemort believed power came from fear, but the power that protected Harry, the power that Voldemort mocked, came from bonds Voldemort had spent a lifetime avoiding. Bellatrix Lestrange adored Voldemort with the twisted fervor of a zealot, but he never returned her feelings. To him, loyalty was useful only as long as it guaranteed obedience. He never trusted, never cared, never shared. Even his inner circle lived in fear, not respect. When Snape died, Voldemort did not mourn him. He barely hesitated. He saw people as tools, easily discarded. Yet, ironically, it was the loyalty of others that protected Harry time and again. Hermione risking her life to erase her parents' memories, Ron returning after abandoning his friends, even Draco lowering his wand in the Room of Requirement. All these moments, born from emotion, unraveled Voldemort's empire. Voldemort thought love died with the person. He didn't realize that true love, like Lily's, echoed through time. It left marks not on the skin, but on the soul. It shaped the choices of those left behind. When Harry stood in the Great Hall after his final duel, he didn't do so as a lone hero. He stood backed by an army that had chosen love over fear. Molly Weasley, who faced Bellatrix with a mother's rage, Neville, who drew the sword of Gryffindor and defied his own terror, even Severus Snape, who, despite his bitterness, protected Harry out of a love that had never died. These weren't just allies, they were living proof that Voldemort had failed to extinguish the one force he never understood. His ignorance was most evident in how he viewed Harry himself. Voldemort believed Harry's strength came from prophecy, from blood, from fate. He never considered that Harry's real power came from the people who surrounded him. Dumbledore's guidance, Hagrid's affection, Sirius's loyalty. Voldemort thought killing those people would break Harry, not realizing it only made him more determined. The more Voldemort tried to isolate Harry, the more others rallied around him. When Dobby died freeing Harry, it was not an act of magic, it was love. When Creature led the Hogwarts elves into battle, it was love for Regulus, love born from a single act of kindness. Voldemort never saw these victories coming because they weren't tactical, they were emotional. The battle at Hogwarts was not just wands and spells, it was a war of ideals. The Death Eaters fought for power, the Defenders fought for each other. And while Voldemort stood alone, Harry stood among friends. This contrast was not accidental, it was the culmination of choices made over years. Voldemort chose dominance, Harry chose connection. When he willingly offered Draco's wand back to him, when he buried Dobby with his own hands, when he spared Peter Pettigrew despite betrayal, each of these decisions placed him further from the cold logic that ruled Voldemort's heart. Throughout the books, Dumbledore tries again and again to explain this to Harry, who, in his youth, often shares Voldemort's frustration. Why does love matter? What can it do against curses and cruelty? Yet every major turning point, whether it's the bond formed in the Triwizard Tournament, the DA training sessions in the Room of Requirement, or the silent understanding with Luna and Neville, proves that love weaves a net Voldemort cannot penetrate. His spells hit, but they never destroy. His terror spreads, but never fully conquers. Perhaps the most painful irony is that Voldemort himself was once a boy who needed love, a boy born from a loveless union, raised in a place where affection was foreign. He could have become someone else. Dumbledore gave him that chance. Hogwarts gave him that chance. But each time, Tom Riddle turned away. He feared vulnerability. He feared attachment. And in doing so, he carved out the very part of himself that could have made him human. He chased immortality, not realizing that the only true immortality lies in how we are remembered. Lily is remembered with reverence, Voldemort with horror. Even in death, he could not understand. When his soul was torn from his body in the final duel, when the last horcrux was gone and the Elder Wand refused to obey him, Voldemort did not grasp why he lost. He still believed it was trickery, that Harry had outmaneuvered him. He never realized he had lost long ago when he chose fear over compassion, cruelty over understanding. When he stood in the ruins of his own making, the boy who feared death more than anything found it not at the end of a wand, but in the echo of a lullaby he had never heard. The scar on Harry's forehead was more than a magical relic. It was a reminder that Voldemort's greatest weapon had failed, that despite all his power, he had not defeated a child protected by love. It marked the moment when love proved stronger than death, and for all his mastery of the dark arts, Voldemort could never undo that truth. He died not because he lacked power, but because he lacked understanding. He underestimated what love could do. In a saga filled with dragons, spells, and mythical beasts, it is easy to forget that its true heart beats in the small, quiet acts. A mother's arms, a friend's sacrifice, a teacher's guidance. Voldemort missed them all. He chased thrones made of ash and missed the warmth of a hand in his. In the end, it wasn't Harry who destroyed him. It was love, the one spell he never tried to cast. Number 22, Lucius Malfoy, losing influence in the Ministry. Lucius Malfoy was never meant to be a failure. His heritage, wealth, and influence positioned him to become one of the Dark Lord's most vital assets inside the Ministry of Magic. He carried the pure blood ideology with pride, cultivated connections at the highest levels of magical governance, and had the arrogance of a man convinced of his own importance. Yet once Voldemort returned to power, Lucius began a slow descent from favor. His strategic errors, clumsy execution, and obsessive self-preservation unraveled the trust he had once earned. What should have been a triumphant role within the Ministry turned into a chain of humiliating failures, each more public and damaging than the last. The first of Lucius Malfoy's missteps came not with the return of the Dark Lord, but before it, during his covert service to Voldemort in the early days of Harry Potter's time at Hogwarts. Charged with safeguarding one of the Dark Lord's most sacred objects, Lucius made the impulsive and ultimately disastrous decision to use Tom Riddle's diary as a weapon. Instead of preserving the horcrux, he slipped the diary into the belongings of an 11-year-old girl, Ginny Weasley, in an attempt to discredit Arthur Weasley and undermine the Muggle Protection Act. His scheme backfired catastrophically. The diary was destroyed by Harry Potter, and though Lucius never learned its true nature, Voldemort certainly did. "You lost me one of my treasures," he would later hiss, his voice colder than death. That failure was never forgiven. Years later, with Voldemort restored to corporeal form and gathering his loyal followers, Lucius had a second chance. At the Department of Mysteries, he was given a mission not only vital to the Death Eaters, but one designed to test his loyalty and competence. Leading a team of Death Eaters, Lucius was tasked with retrieving the prophecy concerning Harry Potter and the Dark Lord, a prophecy that Voldemort believed might contain the key to his survival. The Ministry infiltration was meant to be surgical, swift, and silent. Instead, it collapsed into chaos. Lucius, whose leadership was supposed to be decisive, found himself outmaneuvered by children, members of Dumbledore's army delayed them, and the arrival of the Order of the Phoenix turned what should have been a precise operation into a street fight. As the prophecy orb shattered in the heat of battle, so did Lucius's status in the eyes of his master. "He's no longer of use to me," Voldemort muttered later, his disdain undisguised. While other Death Eaters escaped, Lucius was captured and imprisoned in Azkaban. It was not just a personal downfall, but a strategic loss. The Ministry had been infiltrated, and now the headlines screamed of masked attackers and secret wars within the government. His arrest made Voldemort's return undeniable, exposing the movement far earlier than Voldemort had planned. In that moment, Lucius had failed not only the Dark Lord, but the cause itself. His time in Azkaban was short, but the damage endured. When Voldemort freed him, it was not out of loyalty or mercy, but necessity. The Dark Lord needed Narcissa and Draco to execute the plan involving Dumbledore and Severus Snape, and Lucius, shattered and trembling, was dragged along like an echo of his former self. No longer a trusted hand, he was now a man who watched the new world order being built without his voice or control. His wand, the symbol of his power, was eventually taken from him, confiscated by Voldemort for his own use during the hunt for the Elder Wand. "Your wand, Lucius. I require it," the Dark Lord said, and Lucius did not dare protest. This erosion of dignity was more than punishment. It was a symbol to all Death Eaters of what happened to those who failed. Lucius had been a proud figurehead of pure-blood dominance, and now he stood in corners during meetings, silent and avoided. The shame burned deeper than any Azkaban chill. His son, once a symbol of his pride, had become Voldemort's hostage. Draco was forced to perform tasks no boy should face, all because his father had disappointed the Dark Lord too many times. The Malfoy family name, once honored, feared, and respected, was now a byword for disgrace. Lucius's collapse was not born of cowardice alone. It was a mixture of misjudgment, inflated self-worth, and fear. He imagined himself more capable than he truly was, believing his political cunning could transfer seamlessly to war. But war required clarity, and Lucius had none. His decisions were driven by panic, masked as strategy. He overestimated his influence, underestimated Dumbledore's allies, and misunderstood the nature of the Dark Lord's wrath. The wizard who had once pulled strings behind the scenes became a ghost, present but hollow. When the Battle of Hogwarts drew near, Lucius's role was no longer that of a commander or even a lieutenant. He and his wife wandered the castle's ruins, not fighting but searching desperately for Draco. They were no longer crusaders of blood purity, but parents fearing for their child, The transformation was total. Lucius, once feared in the corridors of the ministry, now looked lost, his long blonde hair dishevelled, eyes darting for glimpses of his son amid the rubble. He had tried to play the Grandmaster, and he had become a pawn. In the end, Lucius survived not because of his loyalty or skill, but because of his insignificance. He was not hunted by auras after the war, not imprisoned again, not executed for crimes against the state. The victors saw what Voldemort had already seen. Lucius Malfoy was broken. He no longer mattered. His punishment was not death, but irrelevance. The man who once dined with ministers and whispered to the shadows of power was now a relic. Unwelcome in high society, unwelcome among Death Eaters, and unwelcome even in his own reflection. There is a lesson in Lucius's arc, a warning carved into the bones of his failure. Influence without courage, pride without foresight, loyalty without competence, all are doomed to crumble. Lucius Malfoy embodied these contradictions. He longed to be important, but fled from accountability. He claimed to be a servant of Voldemort, but served first and foremost his own vanity. In the end, he was neither feared by his enemies nor trusted by his allies. He was nothing. Even within the Malfoy manor, his authority waned. Bellatrix Lestrange, once an unwelcome guest, took over the house with the force of a conqueror. Voldemort made the Malfoy home his headquarters, and Lucius had no say in the matter. He stood by as his dining table became a place of torture, as Muggle Studies professor Charity Burbage was suspended above it like meat. "Please, please," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But there was no mercy in that room, neither for Charity nor for Lucius. It was no longer his house, it was Voldemort's. Lucius's story is not a tale of redemption. He never found clarity or courage, never fought to right his wrongs. He merely faded, praying for survival. The Dark Lord's collapse may have freed many, but for Lucius, it simply ended the nightmare of judgment. He escaped justice not because he was clever, but because he was pitiful. That perhaps is the most damning legacy of all, not being feared, not being punished, but being forgotten. In a world of giants and martyrs, Lucius Malfoy was a man of small spirit, pretending to be large. He climbed high on the strength of heritage and cunning, but collapsed because he had built nothing of substance. And when the winds changed, there was nothing left to hold him up. The Dark Lord took everything, his power, his pride, his wand, and gave nothing in return. His final defeat wasn't at the hands of Harry Potter or Albus Dumbledore. It was slow and internal. It was the moment Lucius realized that no one followed him anymore, that his decisions no longer mattered, that his name, once heavy with menace, was now whispered with pity. This was not a villain's fall. This was a bureaucrat's ruin, self-made and richly deserved. Number 23, Bellatrix Lestrange killing Dobby. Bellatrix Lestrange had always been known for her cruelty, but it was not until she flung that silver knife through the air at the Shell Cottage beach that her malevolence reached its most reckless and ultimately self-defeating form. As Harry Potter and his companions escaped the clutches of the Death Eaters, it was not a seasoned aura or one of the Order of the Phoenix whom she struck down, but a house elf. Dobby, the brave and loyal servant who had defied everything he had been raised to accept, fell with a knife in his chest. And in that singular act, Bellatrix not only ended a life, but also set into motion the final emotional evolution of the boy who would destroy her master. What made this decision so painfully illogical was how little Dobby appeared to matter in the grand scheme. To Bellatrix, he was beneath consideration, a servant, a creature, a non-entity, not worth more than a sneer. And yet, as she watched the group disapparate, she reached for violence in a flash of rage, throwing the blade not at Harry, not at Ron or Hermione, but at the smallest figure, the one who dared speak against her with no wand, no bloodline, no social worth in her world. She acted not out of strategy, but spite, a hallmark of the Death Eater's fatal flaw. They struck at what offended them, not what endangered them. "You filthy little monkey," she had snarled earlier, words soaked in hatred, before throwing the knife that would seal her place in the final chapter of Voldemort's downfall. Dobby, for his part, had just completed one of the most important acts of rebellion in the entire war. He had infiltrated Malfoy Manor, disarmed enemies, and freed Harry Potter from what could have been a final capture. He did it not for glory or power, but for love and loyalty. "Dobby has come to rescue Harry Potter and his friends," he had announced with pride moments before they escaped. He stood not as a servant, but as a symbol of emancipation, a walking contradiction to everything Bellatrix believed in. That she killed him was both symbolic and short-sighted, a move that would cost the Dark Lord more than he could have imagined. Bellatrix never understood that true power lies not in domination, but in inspiration. Her knife pierced not just Dobby's chest, but the thin veil of emotional restraint Harry had maintained up until that point. Until then he had been wavering, reacting, unsure of his next move, but kneeling over Dobby's small, still form, digging a grave with his bare hands, Harry changed. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf," he carved into the stone. It was not just a eulogy, it was a vow. The boy who had always been reluctant to lead, who had hesitated to believe in his own judgment, now saw the war in a new light. It was not just about horcruxes or prophecies, it was about the small, innocent lives that depended on someone standing up to tyranny. This moment served as the emotional fulcrum in Harry's journey. He had witnessed death before, Cedric Diggory, Sirius Black, Albus Dumbledore. But Dobby's death was different. It was undeserved, unjustified, and deeply personal. Dobby had asked for nothing, sought no reward, he had only wanted to help. In return, he was murdered not for being dangerous, but for being defiant. And it was that defiance, so small and seemingly insignificant, that enraged Bellatrix into acting out of impulse rather than purpose. In killing Dobby, she revealed more about the weaknesses of the Death Eaters than any strategic failure could. The Death Eaters often believed that fear was the strongest form of control. They underestimated the power of grief, of memory, of legacy. When Bellatrix hurled her knife, she thought she was silencing a pest. Instead, she carved a wound into Harry that would never fully heal, and in doing so, strengthened his resolve to end her reign. It was not the Cruciatus curse or the unforgivable incantations that broke Harry's hesitation. It was a quiet moment, a beach at night, and the still body of a friend who had no reason to die. He was buried without magic, the narrator noted, a wizard with all the powers of the world at his disposal, choosing humility to honor someone who had none. Had Bellatrix been more calculating, she might have saved her fury for a more potent target, but her contempt for anything beneath her blinded her, as it did so many of Voldemort's followers. They looked down on love, on friendship, on loyalty, and yet those were the very weapons they could never overcome. Dobby's death did not demoralize Harry. It ignited him. It made the coming mission not just urgent but sacred. It gave every horcrux he would destroy a name, a face, a reason, and in that way Dobby's legacy lived on, while Bellatrix unknowingly condemned her cause to failure. When Voldemort learned of the escape from Malfoy Manor, there was no indication that he mourned Dobby's death or even acknowledged it. To him, it was an irrelevant loss. But that blindness to the emotional undercurrents of war was what would ultimately cost him everything. Bellatrix's act, intended as a show of dominance, became the Death Eaters' most symbolic misstep. They failed to see that the war was no longer just about politics or bloodlines. It had become a moral reckoning, and Dobby, in death, stood taller than any of them could understand. The moment also redefined the war for the audience. Readers had witnessed horrors before, but the murder of Dobby cut differently. It stripped away the fantasy and left behind the cruelty of war. It reminded us that sometimes the smallest heroes suffer the greatest losses. Dobby had no wand, no patronus, no prophecy, but his bravery had teeth. He acted when many did not, and his death, delivered by a woman too blind to see his value, served as a brutal testament to how evil often consumes itself through misjudgment. Bellatrix's downfall began not with a duel or betrayal, but with that throw. That one moment encapsulated her fatal weakness, the inability to perceive strength in the humble. When she later faced Hermione in the Battle of Hogwarts, the same miscalculation repeated itself. She laughed until it was too late, always believing herself invincible, but the world she had tried to subjugate was rising, and Dobby's grave was one of the first stones in that wall of defiance. He had been a servant, but in dying for freedom he became something far greater, a martyr. It is no coincidence that after Dobby's death, Harry's path sharpened. His instincts grew keener, his choices bolder. He was no longer chasing horcruxes to fulfill Dumbledore's vision. He was doing it because he could no longer bear the weight of loss. He would not let Dobby's death be for nothing. "Dobby is free," had been his proud declaration. Bellatrix, with her contempt, had aimed to erase that freedom. Instead, she enshrined it forever. In the end, the irony is almost too perfect. Bellatrix Lestrange, who valued purity, power, and bloodlines above all, was undone by the very traits she despised. A house elf, born into servitude, died a hero. A boy she considered weak and naive became her destroyer. Her hatred blinded her to the power of loyalty, to the fire of a cause greater than self-interest. She believed fear could control the world. She forgot that love could liberate it. Bellatrix did not plan to make Dobby a symbol. She simply wanted him gone. But her knife created a martyr whose death echoed louder than any speech or battle. It hardened Harry's heart, but not with vengeance, with purpose. It reminded everyone watching that this war was not won through force alone, but through the courage to stand, to act, and, when needed, to fall. Dobby's fall was not in vain. It marked the beginning of Voldemort's end, and it all began with a silver knife thrown in anger by a woman too arrogant to know she had just lost. Number 24. Voldemort not trusting his own followers. Voldemort's greatest mistake was never a curse or a duel. It was his inability to trust. In the silence between the Dark Lord's orders and the hurried steps of his followers lay an unseen fracture, one that stretched across every corner of his regime. While he believed himself to be the master of life and death, Tom Riddle never mastered the fragile art of loyalty. His rule was one of fear, not fellowship, and the consequences of that choice echoed more powerfully than any spell. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the strongest magic, but the one with no one left to fight for him. Voldemort's failure to build real unity among his Death Eaters did not simply weaken him, it isolated him. He never spoke of his intentions with clarity, even to those he favoured. Lucius Malfoy, once the jewel of Voldemort's circle, learned this the hard way. Entrusted with the diary, one of Voldemort's most precious horcruxes, Lucius was never told of its true nature. It was a test, masked as a task. When the diary was destroyed in the Chamber of Secrets, the fallout was brutal. Voldemort did not see the loss of a valuable artifact as an accident or strategic misstep. He saw it as betrayal. Lucius, once a proud and respected pure-blood aristocrat, was reduced to a trembling shadow in the corner of the drawing room. His fall from favour was not due to open rebellion, but due to Voldemort's unrelenting distrust. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps his most loyal servant, was never privy to the depths of his mind. Her devotion bordered on worship, yet Voldemort withheld the very truth that could have rewarded her loyalty. She did not know the final pieces of his immortality puzzle. She only guessed, pleaded, and acted blindly. And when she watched her sister Narcissa lie to him in the Forbidden Forest, claiming Harry Potter was dead, Bellatrix was too far gone in fear to question anything. Voldemort had shaped her not into a general but a fanatic, a woman willing to burn the world for him, yet never trusted with the map. Trust was foreign to him. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore told Harry, "You are protected in short by your ability to love." Voldemort, in contrast, was protected only by his ability to manipulate. He had no inner circle of equals, no shared meals or private strategy councils. His decisions came from high above, unchallenged and unexplained. While Harry trusted Hermione to keep secrets and Ron to stand guard, Voldemort entrusted no one. He saw others as pawns, disposable and replaceable. Even Nagini, his constant companion, was not immune to his fear. She was not just a serpent, she was a horcrux, imprisoned in her own coils, as much a hostage as an ally. When Voldemort returned in the Goblet of Fire, he made a theatrical entrance, commanding the graveyard like a stage. He summoned his Death Eaters, calling them out for abandoning him, even when many had believed him dead. "You return to my side," he hissed, out of fear and not loyalty. His words were more a warning than a welcome. And from that moment forward, his leadership was tainted by paranoia. He never forgave them, not really. Every smile from his followers was laced with tension, every bowed head a shield for silent dread. He didn't build an army, he collected hostages. Snape, the most enigmatic of his followers, played a long and deadly game. Voldemort believed he was manipulating him, using the Potions Master to infiltrate Dumbledore's circle, but it was Snape who held the true double edge. Voldemort, so convinced of his superior intellect, never considered that someone could deceive him with such precision. Even after killing Dumbledore, Snape was never fully embraced. He was a tool, not a brother in arms. Voldemort never asked for his opinion. He gave orders and expected silence. In the end, Snape died not at the hands of the Order, but by Voldemort's own decision, murdered so the Elder Wand would serve its true master. Trust would have saved him. But suspicion drove him to kill the only man who had protected his secrets best. And there was Peter Pettigrew, the weakest yet most telling piece of Voldemort's fractured inner world. Wormtail resurrected his master, sacrificed a hand and served without ambition, but he was never seen as valuable. Voldemort gave him a silver hand that crushed him without command when Peter hesitated in the cellar of Malfoy Manor. It was a message to all the others: hesitation is death, mercy is weakness, but a man who fears for his life will never fight with passion. Wormtail could have died for Voldemort, but instead he died by his own hand, symbolically killed by the cruelty of the master he tried to save. The Order of the Phoenix, by contrast, thrived on mutual belief. When Sirius risked exposure to check on Harry, when Lupin stood in the shrieking shack, or when Molly Weasley faced off against Bellatrix to protect her daughter, their courage was not born of command, it was born of connection. They were bound not by oaths or blood, but by trust. The trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, risked everything, not because they had to, but because they believed in each other. Even when they disagreed, they never stopped protecting each other. That unity was something Voldemort never understood. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort roamed the corridors like a ghost king, issuing orders through fear. "You have fought valiantly," his voice echoed through the enchanted silence, "but you are fighting a losing battle." But it was he who was losing. His army was fracturing. Draco Malfoy fled. The Carrows panicked. Even the Giants fought for pay, not belief. He stood surrounded by strength, but none of it belonged to him. No one offered to shield him. No one volunteered to fall in his place. When Bellatrix died, Voldemort did not grieve. He raged. His army looked to him for meaning and found only punishment. The final duel was more than a clash of spells. It was the culmination of two worldviews. Voldemort, alone, wielding the most powerful wand in existence, backed by an army too afraid to disobey. Harry, surrounded by friends, backed by love and trust, armed only with the truth. It was not the Elder Wand's betrayal that killed Voldemort. It was the reality that the wand could not be loyal to a man who inspired no loyalty. "The wand's allegiance was never yours," Harry told him. And in that moment, Voldemort's face did not show fear. It showed disbelief. As if the concept of loyalty, of connection, had never occurred to him. The tragedy of Voldemort is that he was not destined to fall. He was brilliant, powerful, and cunning, but he made himself vulnerable by refusing to build bonds. He sought immortality through objects, not people. He split his soul to conquer death, but in doing so he severed all possibility of love, trust, and kinship. He created horcruxes to avoid dying, but avoided trust and loyalty, two things that could have made him truly invincible in life. He feared betrayal more than isolation, and in the end, it was that isolation that destroyed him. His downfall was foreshadowed not in prophecies, but in choices. When Dumbledore warned that love was a force beyond his understanding, Voldemort dismissed it as weakness, but it was love that returned Harry from the brink of death. It was friendship that carried the trio through forests and fire. It was shared purpose that rebuilt Hogwarts overnight into a fortress. Voldemort thought fear would make people fight harder. He never realized that trust makes people fight longer. In the quiet aftermath of the war, as the castle lay in ruins and the sun rose over a battered hill, Voldemort's body remained untouched by those who once followed him. Not a single Death Eater approached him. No one closed his eyes. No one whispered his name. His death was not a tragedy. It was a silence, an end that came not with screaming, but with indifference. A tyrant dies alone. A friend dies remembered. It was not Harry's spell that ended him, but Voldemort's refusal to believe in anyone else. Had he seen Bellatrix not just as a weapon but a comrade? Had he listened to Snape instead of testing him? Had he told Lucius the truth instead of using him? Perhaps the war would have ended differently. But he chose suspicion over strategy, domination over alliance, and thus the most powerful dark wizard in history was defeated not by a stronger spell, but by the weight of his own mistrust. Number 25, Voldemort returning to Hogwarts after killing Harry. In the dying embers of what should have been Lord Voldemort's ultimate triumph, a single misstep, driven by vanity, arrogance, and a cruel sense of theatre, began to unravel everything. The Dark Lord had done the unthinkable. Harry Potter lay seemingly lifeless in the Forbidden Forest, struck down by the killing curse. The boy who lived was no more, or so it seemed. Yet instead of using this moment to secure his dominance, eliminate resistance, and claim Hogwarts once and for all, Voldemort made a fateful decision. He returned to the castle not as a conqueror ready to finish the war, but as a performer craving applause, dragging Harry's limp body through the gates in a grotesque parody of a funeral procession. That moment, meant to sow despair, became the spark of rebellion. Voldemort's return to Hogwarts with Harry's corpse was not merely a tactical error, it was a theatrical miscalculation. The strategy, if it could be called that, hinged on psychological warfare. By parading the fallen hero before the survivors, Voldemort believed he would break their spirit. He was wrong. The sight of Harry carried lifelessly in Hagrid's arms did bring silence. But it was not a silence of surrender. It was the silence of collective grief, the hush before the storm. Instead of extinguishing hope, the moment solidified resolve. "Harry Potter is dead," Voldemort proclaimed in the courtyard. But the words rang hollow, echoed against stone walls lined with those who had nothing left to lose. Neville Longbottom's defiance would soon shatter the illusion entirely. This critical pause, this unnecessary detour into spectacle, granted the defenders of Hogwarts something far more valuable than strategy. Time. Time to mourn, yes, but also time to remember who they were fighting for. Time to rearm, regroup, and reignite the fire of resistance. Had Voldemort pressed the advantage while the castle was still divided and weary, he might have crushed the rebellion in one swift blow. But instead he let them breathe. He let them feel. And from that breath came a surge of courage that he could never comprehend. Neville's stand in that moment was not an isolated act of bravery. It was the culmination of Voldemort's mistake. The sorting hat, forced onto Neville's head as a punishment, became the symbol of resilience when the sword of Gryffindor emerged from it. With a single swing, Neville destroyed Nagini, the final horcrux. In that act, Voldemort's immortality began to crumble. The very public arena he had chosen for his mock celebration became the place where his fate was sealed. Had he remained in the shadows, continued his war with cold efficiency, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But he needed witnesses, he needed reverence, and it cost him everything. The ripple effects of Voldemort's return to the castle spread quickly through the ranks. Pious thickness fell in the chaos. Fenrir Greyback, emboldened by the Dark Lord's presence, grew reckless and was ultimately driven off by Ron and Hermione. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps Voldemort's most devoted follower, perished at the hands of Molly Weasley, whose fury had been stoked by the sight of Harry's body. Each death chipped away at the illusion of control. The very aura of invincibility Voldemort sought to project became his undoing as the tides of battle turned within the very halls he believed he had already conquered. It is impossible to ignore the symbolism of the Great Hall during this period. Once the heart of unity and learning, it became a battlefield where spells clashed like swords. Voldemort, who had never truly belonged at Hogwarts, returned to it not as a ruler, but as a desecrator. And in doing so, he gave the school a chance to purge itself of his darkness. From Professors McGonagall and Flitwick to centaurs and house elves, the defenders of Hogwarts coalesced into a single body, beating with a heart newly inflamed by grief and vengeance. The irony in Voldemort's decision is profound. In believing himself the master of death, he could not fathom the power of sacrifice. He saw Harry's act of walking into the forest as weakness, when in truth it created a magical protection akin to that which had saved him as a baby. As Dumbledore later explained to Harry in King's Cross, he took your blood believing it would strengthen him. It did. It tethered you to life while he lives. Voldemort's hubris blinded him to the very magic that had eluded him all his life, the magic of love, selflessness, and loyalty. The fallout of this disastrous choice was compounded by Voldemort's increasing instability. As the final duel neared, his calm veneer crumbled. He shouted, raged, and struck with reckless force. The precision of his earlier campaigns, the infiltration of the ministry, the manipulation of the press, the fear-driven control of the populace, gave way to sheer brutality. This was not the mind of a brilliant tactician. This was the fury of a child denied a toy. He had seen victory snatched from him by emotions he had long dismissed as weaknesses, but in the end, those weaknesses won the war. It is worth considering how differently the Battle of Hogwarts could have unfolded had Voldemort chosen patience. If, after killing Harry, he had disappeared into the wind, letting the shock settle, letting his enemies doubt and despair without a body to rally around, perhaps the resistance would have withered. Instead, his ego demanded an audience, his delusion required a demonstration, and in doing so he gave the myth of Harry Potter new life, a myth far more potent than any weapon. This is the cruel paradox of Voldemort's nature. He who claimed to understand power better than anyone failed to grasp that real power does not come from domination, but from inspiration. He built his regime on fear. Harry inspired love. When Harry rose from the dead, metaphorically and almost literally, the illusion shattered. Even the Death Eaters began to falter. Narcissa Malfoy, given the chance to betray Harry, chose instead to protect her son. That single moment of maternal love echoed Harry's own sacrifice and tipped the balance even further. The final duel between Harry and Voldemort was not merely a clash of wands, it was a reckoning. The Elder Wand, stolen and misunderstood, refused to kill its true master. Harry, with humility and clarity, faced his enemy not with arrogance, but with calm certainty. Voldemort's final curse, rebounding on himself, was the physical manifestation of every wrong choice he had made, beginning with that final return to Hogwarts. He died not in a grand blaze of glory, but in a quiet collapse, his body thudding to the floor, no longer feared, no longer revered. Even the setting of Voldemort's defeat is meaningful. He did not die in some distant battlefield, not in the ministry he once controlled, nor in a dark forest where horrors reigned. He died at Hogwarts, the place he had abandoned, despised, and ultimately failed to conquer. It was not Harry who led him there. It was his own need to dominate what he never understood. In the end, he brought himself back to the very heart of the resistance, and in that act sealed his fate. To dissect Voldemort's error is not to mock his downfall, but to understand the anatomy of failure born from pride. Each step he took toward Harry's apparent defeat only revealed his deeper ignorance. His return to the castle was the crescendo of his misunderstanding, a fatal punctuation mark in a war he believed already won. He could not comprehend that true strength does not scream its victories, it waits, it endures, it inspires. The remnants of that day, the broken stones, the burned banners, the blood-stained halls, bear witness to this lesson. Voldemort did not lose because he lacked power. He lost because he misused it. He thought fear would bind people to him forever, but fear is a brittle chain. It snaps in the face of hope, in the presence of courage. And courage was what his parade of dominance unwittingly awakened in every corner of Hogwarts. So when future generations retell the story of the Battle of Hogwarts, they should not only speak of bravery and sacrifice, they should speak of the moment when a tyrant returned to the castle of his youth, hoping to prove his victory, and instead delivered the final chance for rebellion. In seeking to crush the soul of resistance, Voldemort gave it breath. In demanding worship, he inspired revolt, and in underestimating the power of Harry's death, he guaranteed his own. Number 26, Barty Crouch Sr., blind obedience to the rules. Bartemius Crouch Sr. held power in a time of chaos. As the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement during the First Wizarding War, he was not just a bureaucrat, but a symbol, cold, commanding, and unyielding. He was the Ministry's iron glove, a man who sought to crush the darkness of Voldemort's reign not with nuance, but with unwavering rules and a will forged in stone. In public, he became a hero to many, someone finally doing something about the terror. But behind the starched robes and icy stare was a man slowly consumed by his own doctrine. His rigid pursuit of order, once seen as admirable, soon began to mirror the cruelty he claimed to oppose. Crouch believed that justice meant control, and control meant fear. In the face of rising Death Eater violence, he abandoned the very principles of justice his office stood for. "The Aurors are now permitted to use the unforgivable curses," he declared, sanctioning brutality to fight brutality. His measures were swift, merciless, and absolute. Azkaban swelled with prisoners, not just guilty Death Eaters, but suspected ones too. Trials were rushed or skipped altogether. "We'll be fighting them with the same methods they use on us," Crouch once argued, as Sirius Black, an innocent man, was sentenced without trial. The line between protector and tyrant blurred, and Crouch crossed it willingly. Among the many names Crouch signed off to Azkaban, one burned brighter than the rest: Barty Crouch Jr. Caught in the company of known Death Eaters, including Bellatrix Lestrange, Crouch's son was accused of torturing the Longbottoms into madness. The evidence was damning, though circumstantial, and the trial, if it could be called that, was a spectacle. "You are no son of mine," Bartemius declared coldly, casting down judgment not just as a father, but as a judge, jury, and executioner. In a flash of robes and fury, he sent his own blood to rot among the Dementors. The courtroom gasped, the wizarding world applauded, but something vital had cracked beneath the surface. Crouch's decision to punish his son without leniency was not born from hatred, it was born from fear that leniency would be mistaken for weakness. He could not risk being seen as compromised, and so in a moment that should have demanded humanity, he chose optics over compassion. The wizarding world believed he had sacrificed his son for justice, but in truth, he had sacrificed him for reputation. He would not allow sentiment to taint the cleanliness of his rule. Yet what he tried to bury did not stay buried. His wife, weakened by grief and illness, begged him to show mercy. But Crouch's heart had already calcified. Desperate, she made a final request, to take her son's place in Azkaban, using Polyjuice Potion to switch identities. Crouch agreed, not out of love, but out of convenience. His wife died in prison. His son vanished under a charm of concealment, hidden beneath the care of a house elf, Winky. The public never knew. Crouch maintained his image as the incorruptible sentinel of justice, but his perfect mask was already cracking. In his obsession with control, Crouch turned his house into a prison. His son, kept under the imperious curse, lived in a shadowy confinement, deprived of autonomy. But repression breeds resistance. Years of magical imprisonment only deepened Barty Jr.'s hatred, not just for his father, but for the system he represented. Underneath the surface, a storm brewed, and when Winky's vigilance slipped, it exploded. Voldemort returned and found a loyal servant, forged not in freedom, but in captivity. Crouch had tried to destroy a Death Eater. Instead, he had created one. The irony was brutal. The man who sacrificed his family for justice had enabled the return of the Dark Lord. Crouch's own son, masked and cunning, infiltrated Hogwarts under the guise of Alastair Moody. Using Polyjuice Potion, he manipulated the Triwizard Tournament, ensured Harry's victory, and delivered him to Voldemort. No Auror suspected anything. No Ministry agent questioned the oddities. The very structure Crouch had built, a world of blind obedience to procedure, became the tool of his undoing. When Crouch discovered the truth, it was too late. Escaping his captors, Barty Jr. murdered his father and buried the body on Hogwarts grounds. "He was a great wizard, my father," the impostor Moody later confessed under Veritaserum. "But he valued rules more than people." That sentence was not just a confession, it was a eulogy. In his final moments, Crouch had become a victim of the very logic he had imposed on others. Those who show no mercy receive none. The story of Bartemius Crouch Sr. is not one of a villain in the traditional sense. He was not a Death Eater nor a pawn of evil, but he was a warning. His moral rigidity, his insistence that justice required the absence of empathy, was a fatal flaw. He governed with fear, believing that order demanded it. But fear is not a foundation, it is a fracture, and under pressure, fractures spread. If we start acting like them, what makes us different? Dumbledore once asked. Crouch never had an answer. His fall was not immediate, but slow and silent. After the war, his methods were seen as too extreme. He was moved to the Department of International Magical Cooperation, a promotion in name only. There his power waned and his relevance faded. Yet he remained a man of routine, of strict schedules and daily rituals. His mind, once sharp and cold, began to fray. The loss of his wife, the betrayal of his son, the disintegration of his legacy, it hollowed him. He walked the halls like a ghost of a past the Ministry wanted to forget. Even Winky, the devoted house elf, could see the cracks. When she spoke of her master in the Quidditch World Cup's top box, her words trembled with guilt and sorrow. She loved him, but even she understood that something was broken. "He is a good wizard, but he has lost much," she whispered. Yet for all her loyalty, even she could not stop what came next. Crouch disappeared. The man once feared across the wizarding world died alone, unburied, and almost unnoticed. Crouch's legacy was one of ashes. He taught a generation that rules were sacred, that order must prevail no matter the cost. But he never taught them when to listen to their hearts. He silenced dissent in his office, punished uncertainty, and demanded unwavering loyalty. In doing so, he forgot the most dangerous truth of all, that laws without mercy are not justice, but tyranny in disguise. His downfall was not orchestrated by his enemies, but by his own hand, by the choices he made again and again in the name of security. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of his story is that he was not wrong to fear the chaos. Voldemort's rise was real, the terror was real, but Crouch responded to darkness with darkness of his own, and the wizarding world followed for a time. They looked to him as a savior, unaware that the price of their safety was the erosion of their soul. When he fell, no one rose to defend him, not because he was hated, but because he was forgotten. Justice, when wielded without compassion, breeds silence in the end. In the end, Crouch was neither hero nor villain. He was a man trapped between duty and fear, unwilling to bend, unable to forgive. He believed the system he served would protect him if he served it perfectly. But systems do not remember loyalty. They do not mourn their enforcers. They move on. And so the man who sent hundreds to Azkaban, who stood unflinching in the face of terror, was reduced to a name in a report, a body beneath Hogwarts soil, a cautionary tale told in low voices when beat. When Dumbledore warned the Ministry about Voldemort's return, they laughed. When Harry named Barty Crouch Jr., they dismissed him. The system Crouch had built refused to acknowledge its own flaws, even as those flaws came back to haunt it. And so the cycle continued, with new leaders, new rules, and the same blind arrogance. But Crouch's story lingered like a curse, the tale of a man who believed that order was everything, only to discover that justice, without mercy, is a cage, first for others, and then inevitably for oneself. Number 27, Percy Weasley, betraying his family. Percy Weasley's fall from grace did not involve dark curses or murder, but it hurt in ways that scars of magic never could. When the wizarding world teetered on the edge of war, Percy made a choice that echoed louder than many spells ever could. The moment Voldemort returned, resurrected in the graveyard behind the Triwizard Tournament, those close to him were forced to take sides, not simply between good and evil, but between truth and denial. Percy, once the proud prefect and polished head boy, took the wrong side. He clung to the ministry, rejected his family, and became an unwitting tool of the very system that allowed darkness to flourish. His betrayal was not a matter of blood magic or enchanted artifacts, but of silence, distance, and stubborn pride. Percy did not scream in rage or join the Death Eaters. He did something colder. He walked out of the burrow and never looked back. When Harry returned from the graveyard, trembling with trauma and truth, Percy chose to stand behind Cornelius Fudge rather than Arthur Weasley. When Dumbledore stood firm and declared Voldemort's return, Percy aligned himself with the camp that scoffed and denied. He began parroting ministry rhetoric, dismissing the growing threat as hysteria. Percy's betrayal was not flamboyant or violent, but it was methodical, and that made it all the more insidious. For a family as close-knit as the Weasleys, Percy's departure cut deep. Molly Weasley, so warm and affectionate even to those not her own children, was left with an aching absence. Arthur, usually calm and inquisitive, struggled to accept that his son had chosen protocol over kin. Ron's pain was particularly sharp, as he once idolized Percy's achievements. As Dumbledore put it in Order of the Phoenix, the truth is generally preferable to lies. Percy, however, chose lies not out of malice but ambition, and that, in the eyes of many, was more dangerous. Percy's pride was well cultivated. Even at Hogwarts he had always sought the approval of authority, As early as the Chamber of Secrets, readers were shown Percy's obsession with order and status. He carried himself with the air of someone destined for greatness, someone who followed rules not just to survive, but to shine. His blind loyalty to rules made him easy prey for a system eager to silence dissent. The Ministry, desperate to maintain the illusion of peace, found in Percy the perfect mouthpiece. He wasn't evil, he didn't need to be, he only needed to be obedient. What makes Percy's decision especially troubling is the timing. At the height of Voldemort's covert return, when misinformation was more dangerous than ever, Percy was instrumental in spreading it. He joined the Department of International Magical Cooperation and began actively distancing himself from the so-called Dumbledore loyalists. He refused invitations to dinner, he sent back Christmas presents unopened, and most painfully, he accused his own father of treasonous behavior, claiming Arthur was being manipulated by Dumbledore's madness. His role in the anti-Dumbledore narrative was not the act of a villain with a wand, but of a bureaucrat with a pen. The effect of his actions cannot be underestimated. While Voldemort moved silently through the shadows recruiting and killing, the Ministry, with Percy among its loudest voices, distracted the public with petty trials and public denials. Harry and Dumbledore were smeared in the Daily Prophet, a paper that Percy himself admired and trusted. Percy's defense of the Ministry helped fuel public ignorance. In Order of the Phoenix, Percy's letter to Ron is particularly chilling. He writes, "It is my firm belief that Dumbledore has been getting more and more eccentric." To see such language from a son of the Burrow was to understand how far he had drifted. Percy became the archetype of the good man who lets evil triumph by doing nothing, or worse, by assisting ignorance. His belief in the Ministry was so unwavering that he dismissed overwhelming evidence of Voldemort's rise. Even when the Ministry attempted to arrest Dumbledore and fired educators for political reasons, Percy stood by silently. He did not raise his wand in battle for Voldemort, but he helped keep doors open for the Death Eaters to walk through. Without the Ministry's blindness, the infiltration of Hogwarts and other institutions would have taken longer, perhaps even failed. But Percy's story is not entirely one of failure. When Scrimgeour took power, and the Ministry's mask of civility began to crack, Percy still held firm. He was there at Dumbledore's funeral, stiff and uncomfortable, but present. It was a hint of the man who had once loved his family, buried under layers of ambition and shame. And when the final battle approached, something in Percy broke. Perhaps it was the death of innocence, perhaps the collapse of the system he had trusted, but he returned. In Deathly Hallows, Percy's reappearance at the Battle of Hogwarts is one of the saga's most poignant redemptions. He arrives in the chaos, shouting an apology, and begins fighting alongside the very people he had abandoned. He duels with Death Eaters, stands with Fred, and tries to make up for years lost. Tragically, it is too late for some. As Percy fights beside Fred, an explosion kills his younger brother. The scream Percy gives is not just one of grief, but of guilt. He had rejoined the family, but fate had already collected its price. This moment is where Percy's arc hits hardest. His need for redemption is not rooted in heroism, but in regret. He does not seek applause or recognition. He just fights. He holds Fred's body and refuses to leave it. In that silence, he atones. For the letters he wrote, for the dinners he missed, for the coldness he wrapped himself in like armor, he pays with tears and blood. He becomes once more a Weasley, not in name but in loyalty. Percy's betrayal, then, is not the betrayal of a villain, but of a man so devoted to systems that he forgot the value of people. His journey reminds readers that evil does not always wear a skull mask. Sometimes it wears a pinstriped robe, holds a clipboard, and speaks of regulations. Percy's fall was facilitated not by dark magic, but by a dangerous kind of obedience. His loyalty to authority was stronger than his loyalty to truth. There is a kind of horror in watching someone you love become an agent of denial. Molly's grief over Percy is not loud, it is quiet, seeping into her gestures and silences. Arthur's heartbreak is visible in how often he still mentions Percy's name, always with hope, always with pain. For Ron and the twins, Percy's betrayal feels like abandonment, a stain on their childhood memories. And for Ginny, the youngest, it is the first time she understands that blood does not always mean loyalty. What is so deeply ironic is that Percy's decision was born from a desire to do what he believed was right. He did not act out of hatred, but out of fear of being wrong. He feared irrelevance. He feared insignificance. And in trying to be someone important, he lost the one thing that made him truly valuable, his place in a family that loved him not for his titles, but for his heart. The tragedy of Percy Weasley is not that he joined the wrong side, but that he convinced himself it was the only side. He wrapped himself in the flag of structure and climbed ladders built of silence. He stood in the light of office hallways while his family stood in the shadow of war. And in the end, when reality collapsed the world he had built, he found himself alone. Yet his return proves that redemption is possible. Even the most misguided can find their way back, even if the cost is unbearable. Percy wept over Fred's body not just for a brother, but for the years he would never get back. He fought with the Order not as a politician, but as a brother, a son, a man who finally understood that truth was never in a promotion, but in the people who wait for you at home.